Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, triathletics.com. This video is all about pec soft tissue work, but we're not just going to talk about the pec major. We're actually going to talk about four muscles and their contribution to the throwing motion, specifically the pec major, which we have right here, the pec minor, the subclavius, and the coracobrachialis. So all of these are very relevant for being able to get your arm into that horizontally abducted, retracted scapuloid position. Also relevant for being able to get adequate layback. So most people think of layback as just shoulder external rotation, but it's actually not just true ball and socket external rotation. It's also the ability of the scapula to posteriorly tilt and the T-spine to extend. And all these motions coupled together are what allow you to see these crazy, 180 degrees of layback. But it's not just external rotation at the shoulder. If you take one of these athletes, put them on their back on a table and isolate shoulder motion, they might have 120, 130 degrees of actual rotation. So it just shows you how important scapular mobility is to being able to get adequate layback, being able to get adequate retraction. And what we commonly see all the time is that athletes who have a very long history of bench press, not to say bench press is bad, but bench press without doing a ton of mobility work, especially poor form bench press, high reps, high volume. Yes, they may have some hypertrophy and some size, some strength through their chest, their upper body, but they tend to have a lot of restriction, or they can have a lot of restrictions. And we see this all the time where athletes maybe throw a certain velo at 15 or 16 years old, and now they're 18 years old. They've gotten a lot stronger, but their velocity hasn't caught up. Maybe their arm action has started to get a little tighter, a little tenser, and they're starting to limit retraction, horizontal abduction, and layback. So we're going to talk about why that is. So let's just understand some of the very basic anatomy. So the pec major basically attaches from the rear of the humerus to the clavicle, has sternum attachments as well. So when this muscle shortens, again, these fibers are in slightly different directions at different parts, but basically when it shortens, this is what happens. The humerus internally rotates and horizontally adducts. Okay, so this is what the pec major does. This is a bench press. That action is a bench press, but that's its primary function. So you can imagine if this gets adaptively shortened and you're stuck in this position, this is your classic frat guy who is walking around like this with the palms facing backwards. What's that going to do to your ability to get into layback? Well, to get into layback, what do you need? You need the exact opposite. You need horizontal abduction, so you need the ability to open up here, and you need the ability to posteriorly tilt. So it's basically an externally rotate. So it's basically directly opposing what you need at the shoulder to be an effective thrower. This is, in my opinion, why there's all these kind of myths and traditional notions that you should stay away from upper body lifting as a pitcher, is because people realize, like, hey, if you just crank out a ton of bench press, it's eventually going to make your upper body, or at least for certain athletes, they're going to really tone up and it's going to limit their ability to throw hard. If you go and crank out 10 sets of bench press and try to throw hard the next day, you're going to notice your arm doesn't work. Everyone's had that experience. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. It doesn't mean you shouldn't ever bench press, but it does mean that you need to really take care of that length-tension relationship through the pec. And this is why, if you understand the anatomy, it has to have the extensibility to allow that layback and natural throwing motion to occur. Some athletes can just bench press all day. They just are very lax. They don't tone up very easily, and so they never have issues. But a lot of athletes do. And so we need to address the pec major. We also need to address the pec minor. The pec minor attaches from the scapula. There's a landmark on the scapula, which is your shoulder blade, called the coracoid process. But basically you have your scapula, and the pec minor attaches from that coracoid process to the third, fourth, and fifth ribs. Now what the pec minor does is it anteriorly tilts or tips the scapula. And so Garrison's showing anterior tilt, but this is anterior tilt. This is why when you look at, again, guys who have a history of bench press, dips, a lot of times you'll see that shoulder rolled forward from the side. That's the pec minor pulling that shoulder into anterior tilt. Okay. Besides that, the pec minor is responsible for depression of the scapula, so it's not just dumping you forward, but it's also dumping you into depression. This is one reason why you'll often see throwers where their throwing arm, you can just look at them and tell which side they throw with. Their throwing arm is anteriorly tilted, and it's also depressed. Now, it's not just the pec minor that gets tight, it's also the lat that contributes to depression, but a lot of times that's why you'll see kind of that asymmetry. Pec minor's toned up a ton. Then we have two lesser talked about muscles that still have some relevance. If the pecs are maybe 90% of the battle, coracobrachialis, maybe that's 2%, and the subclavius is 8%. The subclavius is particularly relevant because it attaches the first rib to the lateral part of the clavicle. So when the subclavius gets tight, the subclavius is responsible for depressing the clavicle, It's also responsible for raising the first rib during respiration. But a lot of athletes have issues with thoracic outlet syndrome, and they start to mash down on all the tissues and vasculature that run between this clavicle and the first rib. You'll notice I kind of drew his rib cage underneath, but there's a gap through there where a lot of vasculature runs, a nerve supply, and so that can get really pinched in thoracic outlet syndrome. But anyway, the subclavius that's the link between the two. And so if that tissue gets super gritty, you actually reduce the space. And so if he goes overhead, that clavicle needs to be able to upwardly rotate. And so if you don't have space here, there's no room for it to upwardly rotate, you start to get pinching in there. And so opening up the subclavius can really help with that. People also don't realize that the clavicle, it doesn't just rotate, so go overhead again. And again, you can kind of see where I've drawn it. Go down and up. The clavicle needs to be able to rotate, upwardly rotate, but it also can posteriorly rotate as well. So when there's a limit to that layback and the scap can't tilt backwards, sometimes it's because the clavicle, which articulates with the scap, can't pivot. And the link there is the subclavius. So we'll show you in a second how to address this on yourself, but if that subclavius, that underside of the clavicle, is super tender, super sensitive, that can be the missing link as to why you're not able to get that clean layback. Maybe you're having some impingement symptoms in your shoulder because the scap can't get back. And it's not always just the pec. We need to address all the links. And these are the four main ones. The fourth is the coracobrachialis. The coracobrachialis is one that we didn't address for a long time, but I noticed a couple of years ago, my arm was feeling just very tight. I felt like I was missing that top corner of my range, like I couldn't get that last little bit of flip up, retraction, layback. And I realized that all my tissue quality was great through the pec, subclavius, pec minor, but the missing link ended up being the coracobrachialis for me. Coracobrachialis, it's slightly connected. Its primary responsibility is flexion and adduction. So let's say you were doing farmer's walks or trap bar carries. It's going to serve a stabilizing role to adduct the humerus towards the midline, or shoulder flexion, like a front delt raise. But the coracobrachialis also has a horizontal adduction and an internal rotation function, similar to the pec. So horizontal adduction and internal rotation. So similarly, you're going to feel a limit if that's an issue. If that's shortened down on you, you're going to feel a limit, horizontal adduction and external rotation. So those are the four relevant muscles to be able to get that scap load and free and easy layback. So let's show you guys some partner releases that you can do, and then I'm also going to show you guys some self-release work that you can do. Again, for all the partner release stuff, just make sure that I would recommend that you use a licensed therapist to do these. I'm just giving you some ideas. This is stuff that worked for me in my personal career. Garrison has given me his consent, so definitely take this with a grain of salt and make your own decision about if you want to do the partner versions or if you want to do the self-myofascial release versions. All right, so for the partner release, there's a couple different options. We're going to start with the pec. Now, for the sake of this, the pec major and the pec minor, we're kind of all searching through similar spots. Really, the main problem points are going to be through this pec minor range, through this top corner. That's where you're going to find probably 80 or 90% of your issues. There are still going to be potential issues as you search through the clavicular head portions of the pec, the sternal head portions of the pec. So I'll show you how to do that as well and kind of search for other little density points. But most of the issues, especially the excess tone just from history of bench pressing, things like that, are going to be in this kind of pec minor, pec major intersection right through this corner right here. So the easiest thing to do from the start as a partner is you're basically just going to kind of section this off into 3 sections. So lower, middle, and upper pec minor. So all I'm going to do is basically a pin and stretch technique. Pin and stretch, basically active release. You shorten the muscle with pressure, and then as that pressure is held, you take that muscle through an eccentric, a lengthening range of motion. So basically I'm going to pin the tissue, so just relax so that's not too balled up. Okay, I'm going to start lower pec, basically search around until he tells me where there's a spot that's tender. And so let's say all of it was tender. If it's over about a 2 out of 10 tenderness, that's something that's probably worth addressing in our experience, just what we've seen with athletes. You can't squeeze your pec and just grip on it and feel like nothing's, no problem at all. You probably have a little bit of tissue adhesion, tissue sensitivity. It's probably worth addressing. So let's say he was a 4 out of 10 on his lower pec. It's probably worth addressing. So we're going to grab that where it feels the densest. I'm going to pin that, and he's going to basically go through a diagonal raise pattern. So thumb down, crossbody, thumb up. You can help to be a little bit towards the edge of the table if you want to scoot towards the edge of the table, just so that you have room for that arm to clear a little bit past the table. So let's do 2 passes for the video. You would stay on here until you felt it kind of reduce in sensitivity, maybe 10, 15 passes. So you can be a little aggressive here as if you're the partner kind of working on it. But again, it's based on your own sensitivity and what you can tolerate. Again, I'm just grabbing the meat of that pec minor, applying pressure, and we're doing the pin and stretch technique. So we could do a couple there, we could do 10 or 15 there. Now we'll transition to the middle of the pec minor. This is where you'll probably find most of your issues, is right in the meat of the pec minor. So we're going to get right there, give him a good amount of pressure. You notice that one's pretty gnarly for him. And we would do 10, 15, maybe 20 passes there. Then we would transition to that upper third, upper pec minor. Again, there's no real right or wrong. Like if you find here is a little more dense or a little bit higher up is more dense, chase the density and the sensitivity in the tissue as far as where you want to focus your time. But we would do a couple more up here. Go ahead. And again, I'm giving a good amount of pressure. This is going to be pretty painful if you've never done it before, especially if you're watching this video and we establish you as a candidate for this. It's going to be pretty painful. So just expect that the first time you do it. It's not going to be pleasant. The cool thing about this is if it's kind of a neural tone, neural tension issue, it's basically your body like being in protection mode. It's your body just needs an altered input to tell you, hey, it's okay to allow this tissue to lengthen. You don't have to be chronically holding tension in that muscle. So it gets better pretty quick is the point in most athletes. If it's just kind of a few years of bench pressing, it gets better pretty quick. Within a few weeks, you should see, hey, it's only a 3 out of 10 today or 4 out of 10 instead of a 7 out of 10. So that's the cool part about this. So that's the first way that you can release the pec minor with just like a pin and stretch technique. If you want to get a little bit more aggressive, you can use a partner's elbow. So the easiest way I found to do this is the partner can face their back to the table, and then basically they can now position their elbow, again, low, middle, or upper pec minor. So we can just start in the middle of the pec minor and kind of search around through this whole area for where his sensitivity is the worst. So you can kind of tell me where it's the worst.
Right there.
Right there. Okay, so from here, how much weight I want to give him is totally up to what he can tolerate. So right now I'm maybe giving him like 20, 30 pounds, barely any. But if I want, I can very easily give him 100 pounds just by sinking my body weight into that. Okay, there's a couple options from here. We can still do the diagonal pattern. If he can't actively go through that range, then I can very gently just control his arm down. You don't want to yank on their arm in this position, but you can just pin that tissue and use gravity to let it fall. So again, just a different, slightly less taxing way to do a pin and stretch technique. And the other thing we can do, again, pec is a horizontal adductor and internal rotator. So we can basically take you into horizontal abduction, but we can also take you into external rotation. So you can do the diagonal raises, but you can also keep the elbow static and just do external rotations. Good. So maybe 10, 15, or 20 of these until that sensitivity dies down. Okay, from here, I'm just going to show you the subclavius release that you could do with a partner, and then that'll kind of wrap it up for the partner releases, and then the rest of them you can do on your own or substitute all of this on your own as well. So subclavius, I've drawn this in red. So you're basically just going to search through the length. You're going to feel this you're going to feel the clavicle. You're going to feel this bone running from the sternum, and you're basically searching under the clavicle, up that length. So it's probably going to be somewhere in the first 2/3 of the length of that clavicle where he's going to be sensitive, if at all. So you're just hooking your way under that clavicle, and you're just going to apply a little bit of pressure, cross friction, and he's going to tell me where it's the most sensitive. That probably, to me, that feels like the worst spot. Maybe in there, somewhere in this range. So all you're going to do is you're going to get in that area, and we're going to just give him some pressure and cross friction. So what is that out of 10?
Probably 3.
Probably a 3.
No, it's 4 now.
Depending on the pressure, 3 or 4. So I might stay there for a minute, 2 minutes, until you tell me it's a 1 or a 2. Okay, same thing for this. You can do overhead raises, so as I'm doing this, he can just work overhead. Okay, that's it for the partner releases. For From here, you can do some self-releases as well. So let's hop to that now. All right, so how to do the subclavius release on yourself. It's basically the same process. One tip that I have and that I found is helpful is to sit on a table and kind of let your scap roll forward a little bit. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a little bit of a gapping, a little bit of space under the clavicle to actually access the subclavius a little bit better. If you're already back here, you can only kind of get like the top fibers of it. But if you let that clavicle roll forward, you can kind of wedge your thumb up underneath that clavicle, and you can start to expose some of that tissue, get under there a little bit better. So just sink your body weight and search from the sternum part of the clavicle right underneath it, all the way up that first roughly 2/3 length of the clavicle. And again, you're just going to use a thumb, cross friction, wherever it's the densest. Stay there for 1 to 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how long it takes for the sensitivity to die down. And then the second self-release you can do is the coracobrachialis release. Again, your coracobrachialis, just so that you kind of are aware, so if you flex your bicep, it's not this top muscle right here, but it's kind of like the medial part of your bicep. So it runs right here. You'll feel it. It's kind of a distinct separate muscle there. But you're going to just search across the length of that. You sometimes need to search all the way up underneath kind of the delt. So sometimes you really need to get all the way up in there. Just trace the length of the muscle all the way up, all the way up, all the way up. And you'll sometimes find some really gnarly spots right up in there, kind of closer to the attachment point. This is same thing, 1 to 2 minutes. Just work through any sensitive points there. You can also do some different bicep fascial stretches. So you could ask your coach about that. If this seems to be a particularly problematic issue for you, different bicep stretches can help target this as well. So those are the self-releases you can do just with your own hands. Now let's get to pec major and pec minor release that you can actually do with a barbell to mimic the feeling of having a partner with their elbow. So to set up the pec barbell smash, you're just going to take a lacrosse ball, a barbell, and then wrap that ball to the bar. We prefer to use a voodoo band just because they're cheap, they're super useful for other things besides this, and it's a little bit easier to take on and take off versus using something like tape or an ace bandage, which doesn't really work quite as well. So just wrap a voodoo band tight around the ball. Now you've basically created an implement that we're going to use to mimic an elbow and drive that into the pec minor. So you're going to position the ball in that same corner where you're trying to target all different parts of the pec minor. You can play around, figure out where the most sensitive spots are. Again, it could be upper, middle, lower pec minor. It could be a little bit more medial, a little bit more lateral. You're going to have to play around with the area and focus on the spots that are the worst for you. As this starts to get less sensitive and just the bar's weight alone isn't enough, you can actually add plates to the top of the bar. So start with 5 to 10 pounds. And what we've seen is that once you get to the point where the pec is no longer an issue, typically guys can put 20 or 25 pounds on the bar and kind of sink it, relax it into the pec minor, and really just hang out and feel like it's not too much of a big deal. So for me personally, that's what mine feels like. At the point at which you do feel like you can put 20 to 25 pounds on the bar and don't really feel anything, you've probably kind of graduated from this exercise. It's probably one that you can just revisit a couple times a month and perfectly maintain that tissue quality. So really let the sensitivity and the density of the tissue and the quality of that tissue kind of guide how much you need to do this and how little you might need to do it once you've progressed from it. So same rules apply. We can go into external rotation, and we can also do overhead raises from this position. You'll really find when you go into external rotation that it kind of uncovers some different layers of the pec minor and exposes some new sensitivity once you get into that externally rotated position. So definitely encourage you to play around with that position and explore this exercise. This is one of our staples since we started the company in 2015. This has been such a game changer for our athletes as far as being able to open up that range and restore that tissue quality for the pec on their own without needing a partner, and while still being able to train their upper body heavy. And then a final thing that you can do is just take the time every week to kind of explore the different parts of the pec, explore along the ribs, and see if there are any other dense spots that open up. Sometimes you might have taken care of the pec minor tissue quality, but you might still find various points or density areas along kind of the sternal or the clavicular parts of the pec major. So if you do notice that any of those are starting to form, just take 30 seconds to a minute. Just kind of give yourself a little love in those tissues, a little bit of pressure across friction, and stick on there until you feel the sensitivity start to die down. But hope you guys found this video helpful. This is a pretty comprehensive look at all the different soft tissues that can contribute and can limit your ability to get overhead safely. So hope this video was helpful, and let us know what you think.